at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you to this half-day conference on Islamic feminism and beyond, the new frontier. Let me first thank Margot Badran, who is a senior public policy scholar at the Wilson Center and has been a great help in shaping a conference we held on women's issues last year and again this year. She always is one step ahead of whatever is happening in the reform movement around the Islamic world when it comes to women's issues. Since last year's conference, and we have the proceeds of the conference outside, so I would urge you to pick up one on your way out. It makes a very interesting read. Since last year's conference, we have witnessed new turns. The massive outcry for democracy by women and men of all ages reverberating throughout Iran following the presidential elections of June 2009 reminds us of fragilities and hopes, how all of us in this globe are bound together, and that justice and equality in our societies withheld from some is justice and equality withheld from all. How can citizens in pluralistic societies whose constitutions mandate equality for all enjoy the practice of gender and religious equality across the public-private spectrum? In what ways are women reformers part of the larger world of male-dominated Muslim reform movement? In what ways and to what extent do women reformers constitute their own movement of reform? Today's conference seeks to address these questions, among others, and focuses on major themes of equality, citizenship, gender, society, and inclusivity throughout the Islamic world, with presentations specifically related to development in Egypt, Iran, Morocco, Tunisia, and Turkey. We are really very fortunate to have a spectacular range of speakers. We are having two panels. The first one will deal with citizenship, gender, and representation, and anything else that my speakers want to address. We are having three speakers on this panel. Amani Jamal, who teaches at the Department of Politics at Princeton University. Nayere Tohidi, she is a professor of gender and women's studies at California State University, Northridge, and Lilia Labidi, who teaches anthropology and psychology at the University of Tunis. Both Nayere and Lilia have another affiliation. They were fellows at the Wilson Center a couple of years ago. I will chair this meeting, and you have bios. We distributed bios, so for the sake of saving on time, each of our speakers will speak no longer than 20 minutes, and we will then open the floor to questions and short comments. Short questions, short comments. Amani, this is your first time at the Wilson Center. A special welcome to you.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor and privilege to be here and to be in the company of my esteemed colleagues. Thank you very much for the generous invitation. Thank you to you and to Margot. Again, I've never been here, so I'm looking forward to my participation here today. I was asked to talk about women's representation, reform, possibilities of reform, and analyzing the factors that may or continue to inhibit the advancement of women. And so I've tried to compile my thoughts on this subject. And I do look forward also to the question and answer session. So basically, to give a broad overview of the status of women in the Arab region, basically, when we look at the status of women in the Arab region, I think as many of you know, there are serious problems. There are some advancements, but we're going to highlight the problems right now, and then we'll talk about the advancements. Women in the Arab world today enjoy the smallest share of parliamentary seats worldwide. They occupy only 9.5% of all parliamentary seats in the region, as compared to 18.8% in sub-Saharan Africa and 18.5% in Asia. Women occupy 4 of 128 seats in Lebanon, 7 of 110 seats in the lower house in Jordan, 8 out of 454 seats in the lower house of Egypt, and 30 of the 389 seats of the lower house in Algeria. Again, 34 of the 325 seats in the Moroccan parliament, and 31 of the 250 seats in the Syrian parliament. Although women are underrepresented in elected or appointed positions, their employment in key government offices is on the rise. Women, for instance, occupy prominent positions in the United Arab Emirates Ministry of Education. The UAE Ministry of Planning reported that female employees exceeded male employees in more than 25 federal institutions, and that's in 2001. You had 16,223 workers who were women and only 9,518 employees who were men. These advancements are noteworthy, but noticeable deficiencies still loom large. The limited presence of women in parliament has raised considerable concern among observers and policymakers alike. Egypt's Amr Moussa, for example, has suggested that women's status in the Arab world will improve only when they hold prominent decision-making positions. In Morocco, women's parliamentary participation hastened the adoption of the Family Code of 2004, the Madawana reforms, yet a recent examination of the last 4 reigning Egyptian parliaments seems to imply that female presence has had no direct effect on the status of gender or the advancements of women's rights in the region. Arab women active in political life are not content with the current status quo, complicating issues. Most women do not see the formal legislative process as a viable vehicle to improve their condition. 68% of Arab women MPs are dissatisfied with the current level of women's political participation, and 80% of women active in public life claim that they could accomplish their goals without having to participate in the formal political process. Several political, material, and cultural conditions continue to stifle women's rights in the region. Now, this is where things get a little bit depressing, because it's a vast set of factors. So political parties remain weak and ineffectual, thereby reducing their impact on policy. The rule of law, too, remains weak in the Arab world, and though some laws guaranteeing women's participation in the public sphere exist, they need to be enforced. The lack of legislation promoting women's presence in parliament also explains their continued marginalization. Only 1 in every 2 women in the Arab world is literate. As a result, their overall political awareness is quite low. Reactionary forces seek to exclude women from the public and political spheres, and many current political regimes promote these conservative elements. Prior to unification, half the judges in South Yemen were women, but since conservative forces have reappointed these women to clerical positions. In fact, the patriarchal political environment is not favorably inclined towards equal participation in the public sphere. This was demonstrated in Kuwait in 2006, where though for the first time women were able to vote in the elections, not a single woman won a parliamentary seat. Yet in the more recent elections, we had 4 women advance to the parliament. However, this trend was reversed in the 2009 election. Finally, the dismal state of Arab economies structures women's access to the public sphere. As standards of living continue to decline across the region and unemployment rates are on the rise, women are becoming unable to afford the education necessary to enhance their social and human capital. This has prompted Liz Cheney back in 2005 to allocate several millions of dollars towards the State Department's MEPI initiative to increase awareness among women, especially in countries like Morocco, with a population that has close to 70% illiteracy rate in the country. Raising awareness among Moroccan women was a considerable and still is a considerable challenge. The impediments to meaningful gender representation are thus located not only in the political realities in the region, but also in the economic, cultural, and religious dogmas. Yet, in some other cases, and we should highlight the successes, we've witnessed significant gains. The reform of the Madawana package, which is basically one of the efforts that we highlight and applaud, was seen as a tremendous victory. Furthermore, what we can learn or take away from the Moroccan case is basically a better understanding of how those reforms were enacted. And there you have to look at the role of international pressure, a committed monarchy, the bringing on board of the religious establishment, and also active women's participation in advocating and promoting and demanding reforms in the Madawana. Before the passage of the substantial reforms, women's access to public life was guided by the notion of guardianship. Women needed the approval of their male legal guardians before they could legally work, travel, or attend university. Furthermore, the existing Madawana laws supported the institution of polygamy, and women had few rights to initiate divorce. The oral divorce remained common and a major threat to women's advancements. This would change in 2003. Moroccan women were granted 2003-2004, where Moroccan women were granted one of the most generous reform packages in the Arab world. Wives' duty to obey their husbands was abolished, and both spouses were made responsible for their households and families. Second, women no longer required the permission of male legal guardian to marry. The minimum marriage age was raised to 18, and polygamy was substantially restricted. And third, divorce was made easier for women, while men could no longer divorce through the pronunciation of talaq. These gains for women have been extraordinarily valuable and seen as some of the most liberal forms on women in the region. Certainly today they serve as the model to emulate elsewhere. However, Morocco also serves as a clear example of a country that lacks the necessary levels of democracy, rule of law institutionalization, and human development to effectively implement these reforms. For example, it is true that even with the Madawana, women will have few legal channels to exercise their new rights, since the rule of law in Morocco is weak and the legal system is rather dysfunctional. Further, more than two-thirds of Morocco's women, or 70%, are illiterate. Knowledge of the Madawana changes is not widespread, and the excruciating poverty of Moroccan men and women may well limit the benefit of these new laws. Nonetheless, these reforms are considered major advances for women and in fact are some of the most progressive laws in the region. And so the reforms were possible because of three interrelated factors: the women's civil society activism, international influence, and the commitment of the monarchy to work with the religious establishment, or at least coerce even the religious establishment to adopt the reforms. Women's groups emerged in the 1970s and 80s to demand their rights and call for reform of the existing Madawana laws, culminating in the 1990s Million Signatures campaign against the existing Madawana. Some advances were made under King Hassan II, who in 1992 signed an earlier version of the 2003 reforms that improved women's status while still falling short of their expectations. The push for reform continued, and in 1995, the king single-handedly eliminated the requirement that women have their guardian's signature in order to obtain a passport. In 1999, women again mobilized to demand additional reforms, and King Mohammed VI, who in fact supported the reforms, had to withdraw legal deliberation at the time due to popular opposition of Islamist movements. As political liberalization in the kingdom allowed proponents of the women's reforms continued space to advance their agenda, so too did it allow for increasing Islamic activism against the reforms. The religious establishment, and here I'm basically treating it as more of a monolithic movement, which is not entirely fair, but more or less the religious establishment, which had grown more active in political and social life during liberalization, openly campaigned against the Madawana package. The Moroccan League of Ulama, an official state body, declared that the plan would undermine Islamic jurisprudence, loosen morals in the kingdom, destroy the sanctity of marriage, and make it more difficult for men to marry, a position supported by the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. Both Islamist groups in Morocco, the PJD and the Justice and Charity Movement, attacked the reform package as a U.S.-American imperialist conspiracy designed to destroy Islamic culture. Nevertheless, the king pressed on with the reforms. He had signaled his sympathy for improving women's position in 1999 in a speech when he asked, how can we expect to achieve progress and prosperity when women, which constitute half of society, have their interests taken away, when the rights with which our holy religion has endowed them to make them equal to men are being ignored. On October 10, 2003, the king presented the Moroccan parliament with his plan to initiate the new modern family law, anchoring his rationale for the plan in Islam, which advocated human dignity, equality, and harmonious relations, as well as cohesiveness of the Malakite right of ijtihad, thanks to which Islam is a suitable religion for all times and all places. The king grounded his explanations in the teachings of Islam and interpretations of the Sharia. Further, the king won support from the leadership of such Islamic groups like the PJD, and then even the Justice and Charity movement, which was even the more conservative movement, who had rejected the reforms earlier. Even Nadia Yassin, daughter of Sheikh Yassin, the leader of the Justice and Charity movement, again the more conservative movement, supported some of the initiatives of the reform package. She indicated her willingness to endorse the reforms when she claimed that the old Madawana was not sacred text and advocated its replacement with a more Islamically appropriate legal guide. Thus, Morocco is an important case to analyze in terms of interpreting, A, how democratic openings allowed for these societal deliberations, and basically understand how the religious establishment was, quote unquote, dragged on board the reform project. So, personal status laws are by far the most the biggest challenge to women's advancement, in my opinion, in the region. The problematic is twofold. On the one hand, the personal status system supplements the legal system in upholding laws that treat women as subjects of their male relatives. Second, the system promotes patriarchal structures so that women have become totally reliant and dependent on the very institutions that continue to deny them equal footing. Even improvements, we often talk about the importance of rule of law, good governments, and the expansion of democracy, which might lead to better, which is good for these things are good for democracy. If you look at it within the context of the Arab world, if we promote good governments, better rule of law, better expansion of democracy, what we might be doing is enabling a better implementation of the existing personal status regime, or what I call the Sharia regime. And so this does not get us at the core issues at hand, which is the personal status laws themselves need to be reformulated in ways that allow for the compatibility of Islam with the principles of equality between men and women. Even more importantly, it appears that the donor community here in the West and in the United States is at an overwhelming disadvantage in dealing with these matters. These issues are considered to be Islamic, domestic, indigenous, and therefore protected from foreign intervention. Personal status laws need to be reformulated, and they need to be dealt with on the level of the logic that drives their legitimacy within their own societies. As existing conservative Islamic interpretations inspire the existing personal status laws, so too the basis of their reformation should be located in Islamic practice, jurisprudence, and rationale. It must be noted that the international donor community has not adequately dealt with the issue of Islamic jurisprudence and its overwhelming influence on the status of women in the region. This is perhaps due to the fact that the donor agencies operate within a secular framework where religion should not impede the status of women, or in other words, the conventional wisdom is that as we promote democracy, secularism will emerge and religion will be relegated to the private sphere and it will go away. And if we look at 50 years of democracy promotion or the quote-unquote democratic trajectory in the region, what we know is that as liberalization has increased, so too has the influence of Islamism, and the role of religion in the public sphere. Or perhaps there's an assumption driving the donor community that democracy is the route to lessening the influence of religion in the public sphere. For whatever the reason, the continued relegation of Islamic interpretation to conservative sectors of Arab and Muslim societies has and continues to terribly disadvantage women. So ignoring this issue or pretending that it will go away has really resulted in hampering the status of women in the region. To the arguable extent that without a constructive and meaningful way to address the issue of Islam and jurisprudence, the status of Arab women will continue to lag behind the rights of women elsewhere in the world. Arguably, the existing situation in Arab societies through which Islamic jurisprudence reinforces the inferiority of women is in complete disregard of the general ethos of the Quran, which recognizes the equality of the genders in several verses. Further, several of the existing interpretations about women rely on the existing interpretations today that inform the personal status law, continue to rely on the most conservative and disputed accounts of female treatment in the tradition of hadith, or the prophetic sayings. What is often missing from our analysis of the potency of Islamic interpretations on the status of women is that Islamic jurists are heavily influenced by customs and traditions when passing edicts that impact the lives of women. Further, Islamic jurists tend to gravitate towards the Islamically prized ethos of social cohesion and harmony. So in order not to disrupt the balance between traditional and modern, Islamic jurists continue to reinforce the subjugation of women and reify patriarchy as a means of preserving harmony, however disadvantageous it might be to women. Hence, men continue to be given priority in matters related to Islamic jurisprudence. Existing personal status laws claim to protect women, and although there are indeed many protections for women in the personal status laws, there also remain discriminatory policies that continue to deny women their basic human rights. These disempowering personal status formulations are especially located in laws that guide marriage, divorce, and child custody. It is important to note that the personal status laws are not monolithic across states, and the fact that we have variation across Muslim states and Arab states, and I'm not using these categories interchangeably, so I apologize, but the fact that there is variation should lead us to inquire, why is there variation? What explains the sources of the variation? Why in some societies we have more progressive laws on the book than in other societies? Nevertheless, it also appears that the personal status regime enjoys popular support in many countries as well, and we need to be cognizant of that. Where women have made significant advancements in their rights, it is because they were able to convince those who upheld discriminatory personal status laws that the Islamic basis or rationale behind such legislation was faulty, and taking on the Islamic interpretations has proven successful to women. Unfortunately, the Western donor community has been less equipped and in fact almost unwilling to deal with a strategy of dealing with the personal status regime on its own basis, dealing with it and understanding the sources of its legitimacy, and basically trying to create a better nuanced understanding of the role of religion in Muslim societies when we deal with democracy promotion and empowering women across Muslim states. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Nayere. You were superbly on time. Thank you. Nayere.
I hope I can be as on time. Thank you. I also want to thank Dr. Hale Esfandiari, Dr. Margot Badran, Ms. Mona Youssef, and Ms. Kendra Heidman for organizing this conference. It's always a pleasure to come back to the Woodrow Wilson Center, about which I have a lot of fond memories from the year I was here as a scholar. It wasn't a couple years ago, it was 2002 years ago. Anyway, since the topic of this panel is citizenship, gender, and representation, I have chosen to discuss two main issues concerning women's citizenship and representation in the case of Iran. Those two issues are the right to vote and gender equality in family law. But first, let me suggest a few suppositions that I have come to reach during my scholarship and activism. First, that I have observed that in Iran and a few other countries that I have studied more carefully, women's rights have been connected to a complex politics, a patriarchal power game, as much as, if not more, to ideology, religion, or religious beliefs, or Islamic tradition. Organized religion is as much about politics and power, such as identity politics, community building, and control, as it is about faith, belief, the quest for spirituality and meaning. Women's rights and gender equality have been parts and parcels of the processes of modernity and extension of democracy. Thanks to the women's movements and feminist discourse, the initially male-centered conception and character of modernity and democracy, civil liberties, civil rights and all that, have become modified to include the female half of the society and other social groups that have been considered minorities. And this has been the case in any context, be it Christian, Islamic, Judaist, Hindu. So this is important to keep in mind, because if we don't understand the intersection of politics, of gender, religion, and also development, especially political development, we may look at the wrong, focus on the wrong things. The present deficit in human rights in general and women's rights in particular, as mentioned by Amni Jamal, especially in Arab worlds and also in many other Muslim majority countries, is therefore connected to the socioeconomic underdevelopment, especially the lag in political development, that is democracy deficit. Cultural factors, specifically persistence of patrimonial and patriarchal gender relations, male bias, sexual mores and attitudes, sanctioned or sanctified by patriarchal construct of religion, that is Islam here, are among the barriers against equal rights and democratization of gender relations and family law. But the problem cannot be reduced to culture or to Islam and the notions such as Islamic exceptionalism or Islamic determinism. Even in a context and country such as the Islamic Republic of Iran, the problem is not just the religion. It is inaccurate and simplistic to draw the line of demarcation between religious versus secular when it comes to the opponents or proponents of the women's rights and egalitarian family law. The past and present quest for democracy in Iran, which has a history of over 100 years, going back to the constitutional revolution of 1905, 1911, including the women's rights movement, show that secular and faith-based groups have been found on both camps. I mean, there have been many laïc or secular people who have taken anti-democratic and anti-women sexist stands as much as religious ones. On the other hand, not all religious groups or individuals have opposed women's rights and democracy. There has been actually kind of tacit collaboration or a patriarchal alliance between secular and religious groups at many times in some very sensitive turning points with regard to women's rights. Therefore, I have come to believe that a holistic approach to this question of women's rights in the Islamic majority countries, especially the issue of development, empowerment of women in literacy, education, economic empowerment of women, employment of women, creation of a strong middle class, modern middle class women that can produce their own reformers, and also a strong civil society participation of women, especially strong women's movement and a strong feminist intervention in the process of reform is a key for achievement of equal rights in the Muslim majority countries, as it has been the case in other places. Also, a governing elite that is willing to to implement the reform, to lead the reform. It is very key. I mean, an elite that is ready to support the women's movement and collaborate with women rather than collaborate with those who oppose women's rights. And another factor which I have come to see as important and necessary is a process of reform within Islam. That is an Islamic reformation and reinterpretation in jurisprudence, in the Islamic Sharia and all that, which again can happen only if there is a strong push by women, especially if women there is at least a group of women who are equipped with the knowledge, with the Islamic knowledge and language and skills to intervene in a feminist fashion within the process of Islamic reformation. That is the role of Islamic feminism or Muslim feminists. Now, let me briefly review these two issues that I said, the right to vote and the family reform, to see why these suppositions apply. And I want to just give you these two examples that support these suppositions that I just suggested. The first time that the issue of the women's rights to vote was brought to the public scene in Iran was during the Constitutional Revolution, and the first Majlis, the first parliament that was established right after the revolution, that is in 1906. And of course only one deputy brought up the issue, and there was an uproar. The uproar was so much that even an influential clergy in the Majlis suggested that this discussion, which was very brief, should not even be included in the formal minutes of the Majlis, because it is too embarrassing to even, let people know that we discussed about the women's right to vote. So even though there were a few women's associations, there were women who were active in the Constitutional Revolution, and there were even some women who assembled in front of Majlis asking for the right to vote. But the movement was very small. The literacy rate was very low in overall population, so they didn't have much impact. In 1911, women's enfranchisement became once again the subject of debate in the second Majlis. This time, again, the same deputy, Vakil Roya, brought up the issue. He passionately gave a lecture that women also, like men, have souls and they are human beings, so they should be able to vote. But of course, there was again very strong opposition, and a very influential cleric, Modarris, spoke against it and said that, just typical thing, that women, Islam considers women to be controlled, and actually men are in charge of women. They don't have the mental capacity to decide and to vote and all that. So it took several years for the issue of women's vote to come up again in the public arena, especially in party politics and in the parliament. During the 1940s, right after the abdication of Reza Shah by the Allied forces because of his alleged collaboration with Germany, with Nazis, there was a period of 12 years of parliamentary democracy in Iran, with lots of political activism and party activism, including women's activism and women's groups. There were several women's organizations, like Jamiyat Zanan Iran, Association of Women of Iran, led by women like Badrul Muluk Bamdad, Sadiq Dawlatabadi, Safiya Firuz, Fatima Sayyah, Nayir Saidi, Furuq Hikmat, Zahra Khanlari, Simin Daneshvar. Some of them, Simin Daneshvar is fortunately still alive, who were active in these organizations, several women's publications. And the central issue they were demanding was the right to vote. So, but what happened was that in 1942, the Democrat Party of Iran, established by Ahmad Qavam, who became a prime minister just for a short period of time, he for the first time proposed again the right to vote. But there was demonstrations against him and lots of opposition, so he did not succeed, even though he even arrested one of the head of one of the really extremist religious groups who were provoking for demonstration and all that. In 1944, to the party, the Communist Party, the pro-Soviet Communist Party, which was very influential in that time, the deputies that were connected to the party also now this time brought up the issue of women's rights to vote with no success. In 1949, Mossadegh, Dr. Mossadegh, the most popular head of the nationalist movement, the National Front, proposed a bill to the Majlis, which was a rather comprehensive bill for reform of the electoral law. That bill included the right of women to vote. So he tried to bring this about in a kind of a less provoking way within a broader reform package. But again, the opposition was fierce, not only among the clerics and the royalists and the forces who were opposing Mossadegh, but even within the more conservative religious factions and some secular factions of the National Front, Jebhe Milli. I am mentioning all these things because there has been a false view, rather common among many scholars and activists, thinking that the right to vote was something granted to women by the generosity of the Pahlavi king, the Shah, just from top down. But actually, I myself thought for several years that, it was just a top-down thing. The Shah decided one day to give the right to women. But if you study the history of women's movement, you see that there has been really a long process, a long struggle for this, to which women have contributed. And there has been a very delicate moment in history why the Shah finally agrees to grant the right to vote. So in not only, as I said, not only religious, like the clerics and conservative religious groups opposed this throughout, but also some liberal, even secular nationalists. I don't know if I have enough time, but maybe during discussion.
I have to rush because you have.
How much I have? Okay. So, because I wanted to read you a quotation from a prominent secular reformer, Hassan Nazi, who 3 decades later became a very important player in opposition to the Islamic Republic of Iran. But in 1949, he stood along with the religious faction and opposed the right to women with very similar arguments. That women don't have the capacity and so that. So if I get a chance, I can read some interesting quotation just to show the mental set of that time. So Mossadegh decided not to push for this because there was, as I said, a riot in Qom. 1 person was killed, 10 person injured, and the Ayatollah Kashani gave a passionate speech against all that. He said, I can't fight in several fronts. I'm fighting the British imperialism and trying to nationalize the oil, and I'm fighting with monarchy, with conservatives, so we have to let the women's rights go. So it was easy to sacrifice women's rights, as it has been the case in many other instances. And then at this time, the only place that women got the right, or at least for temporarily got the right to vote or practice the right to vote, was in the short-lived autonomous province of Azerbaijan. This is 1945, when women went to vote and actually participated in local elections. Now, after the 1953 coup against Mossadegh, supported by CIA and British intelligence, there were lots of, again, women's organizations. Despite the repressive situation, women went on and continued to push for the right to vote and also push for reform in the family law. In 1962-63, there was a period of relative political liberalization under the Prime Minister Ali Amini, a pro-American secular prime minister, and women's right to vote again became an issue of tension between the government and the opposition. But it's interesting that even Ali Amini decided not to support the right to vote, and he, again, in his speeches, made very similar arguments to the religious groups. So he also said that this is too much to ask and too divisive, and let that go. Even though there was now a stronger push for that among women. In 1963, finally, the Shah launched a 6-point program of reforms, which was known as White Revolution. And that 6-point included extension of the vote to women. And as I said, so we need to understand the process that led to this. The Shah was also being pushed by the American administration, the Kennedy administration, to implement some reform agenda. He wanted also, he himself was desiring modernization of Iran and reformation, but he wanted to have all these under his own control. So many women's organizations and independent NGOs were kind of consolidated within one organization, eventually called the Iranian Organization of Women, the Iranian Women's Organization, and that, which was headed by the twin sister of the Shah, Princess Ashraf. And that organization, instead of the Federation of Women's Movement Coalition of 14 independent organizations, now was the kind of state feminism that tried to pursue the reform. And this time, ironically, the force of a very strong man, the king, helped to finally achieve the right to vote. Not only that, but several years later, in 1967, the Shah was also successful, again thanks to the activities of women and the organization of women, and women like Mahnaz Afkhami, Hale Esfandiari, who were fighting within that organization and within the machinery of the state, trying to bring about some reforms. They achieved the Family Protection Act, which for the first time, with of course Hale, I have heard this from Hale, that how they had to go to Qom and meet with the clerics, not you, but other people, had to negotiate and bargain with the clerics and have support of some of the clerics in Najaf to support the reform in the family law. The very reform that, of course, was opposed by Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, after several years, there were some amendments, and that law turned into the Family Protection Law in 1976, right? Which gave a lot of restriction to polygamy and gave child custody right to women and several other reform, the right to divorce especially, which was very important. Now, another interesting thing here is that the same Khomeini that opposed the right to women in 1963, the right to vote, I mean, for women and to women, and also the Family Protection Law. When he came to power in 1979, after the Islamic Revolution, he did not take back the right to vote. Not only that, but he even encouraged women to participate in politics and be present در صحنه باشند in the political scene, to be present and participate in all social realms, but of course this time under his control and in the service of his projects. But he kept opposing the family protection law, and he annulled it right after the establishment of the Islamic Republic. But interestingly, even though he declared its abrogation, in practice, there was no other law to replace it. So in practice, it was the same family law that has been that was used throughout those years until Khomeini died and the new process of reform began within the parliament and by the coalition of secular and Muslim feminists to again kind of go back to the same family protection law, so much that by late 1990s we almost went back with a lot of struggles almost to the same law. But again, because I don't have much time, I'm just jumping historically. After the reform era under Khatami, that several small measures of reforms were possible in the minimum age of marriage and several other things, the family law was almost at the same state of the 1976. But in 2005, when Ahmadinejad took power, we started witnessing a retrogressive trend again. So that in 2008, ironically, under the same name, Family Protection Act, or bill this time, لایحه حمایت از خانواده, Ahmadinejad government started to reverse some of the progressive items of the family law, that is, for example, restriction of polygamy, and try to take away, limited again, make it easier for men to divorce, make it easier for men to be polygamous, and make sigha more widespread, and also put taxation on mahriye, which was the only resort women had. So it was now, thanks to a strong coalition of women made of secular and Muslim feminists, this time the government had to retreat. There was a sit-in the Majlis by prominent feminists like Shirin Ebadi and others. They retreated. But again, now, after this rigged election in 2009 and 2010, we see that Ahmadinejad is bringing back, even though they retreated in 2008, they want now again to go back and reverse some of the achievements of the family law. Now, my question here is that what happened to Islam here? Why Islam all of a sudden changed for Khomeini about women's rights to vote? And why, for example, the same government that did not allow, and the same clerics who opposed strongly when Khatami tried to, for example, appoint a woman minister, they said nothing, and they brought up no Islamic argument when Ahmadinejad appointed a woman minister. Actually, he nominated 3 women as ministers. Ahmadinejad himself argued that things have changed. Women are now demanding changes. And this indirectly admitted that he has to submit to women's will, because there was a strong presence of women during the 2009 electoral process, the presidential election. There was a strong coalition of women who were pushing for reform, and Ahmadinejad, who had lost his legitimacy in the election, wanted to appease women and appoint. So again, you can see that how Islam politics and power game plays here, and it's more complex than just attributing everything to one factor, that is culture or religion.
Thank you very much, Nayere. Thank you. You opened a lot of questions, which we will have enough time for all these questions to be addressed in the discussion. Lilia, please.
Thank you
20
very
minutes.
much. Is it okay?
Yeah, it works. It's on.
Thank
Sure.
you very much, and thank you for this invitation and for giving me the chance to present you on what I am recently working. What I will be discussing with you, that we asked me to talk about this topic, the CSP in Tunisia. Donc, I will present quickly the personal status code and quickly the socio-historical context in which it was produced, and we had already an example what was happened in Iran. And the second topic will be how the little tradition contributed to the construction of the identity in the Maghreb. And the third, and it's something that we never saw in the Arab world and in the Maghreb, and concerning women, how some women in the context of the last few decades, where the demographic importance of unmarried women, youth appears to be increasing in various Arab countries, and find themselves unable to accomplish certain rites of passage, protest against the celibacy in Tunisia as in other different countries as in Morocco and in Egypt, by engaging in particular religious practices that go beyond what is normally performed. The concept that I apologize for my English, I have to read. The concept that I am using are the unconscious significance of hair. The second is the hudud. It's a term that I use. It's in general meaning of moral boundary and limits rather than a narrower sense of punishment mandated by Islamic law. And the third one, which was really very important for this kind of work, is the overconformity, which it has been studied in diverse fields, such as in psychology and psychoanalysis. And several authors wrote about, and I am founding my reading on the result of the studies of Robert Hugh and Jack Coakley, and on Alex Hickert and Dawn Maria Hickert, and on Slavoj Žižek and Eric and Cripps. Pardon. Now, I will go quickly because I don't have enough time. I have only
18 minutes.
Okay. I will go quickly, no problem. Donc, the status code, the most important thing what we have to learn about is that in the Tunisian case, the situation, it's a product of social struggles. Until today, we are seeing today some what we will call reaménagement. I don't think that we can call them regression, but reaménagement. In the context donc, of the women and their rights was the center of thinking of the reformist thinkers in Tunisia, which it began at the end of the 19th century. And we have a proof of it. Several books were published since in the 1976. The first school was opened in 1989. And we had first mixed literary salon, which opened in 1907, and where several women took off their veil in Tunisia and created a big debate for reasons that because it was organized by the French socialists. Here I would like to add another thing. The French, we were under French colonial power, and they had an ambivalent discourse. In one way, they wanted to promote women's rights, and in the same time, and we have a proof of it, they were complicating the relation, the condition of women in Tunisia. Donc, this is one thing. Alors, we saw something what was very important, that it was the movement were supported by elite as a journalist and as thinkers and lawyers, etc. And a big debate took already place toward the veil. And it's something that you had to think a little bit about. Bourguiba Habib Bourguiba, who was the first president of Tunisia and who will promote the personal status code, was in 1929 against the fact that the women take off the veil. And the reason why, it's probably because already he was aware about what's happening in some countries, Muslim countries, where the communist power, the party, arrived and then obliged, some women took off their veil and some of them were killed by their family because they took off the veil. Now the question is why the parents killed them because they took off the veil. These will be in the discussion what I will try to discuss with you. Now, another event which was very important, it's that in 1930, Tahir Haddad, a thinker as important as Qasim Amin in Egypt, wrote two books, one about the workers and one about the women conditions. But the book that was about women was very hardly discussed, and 5 years later, I summarize, 5 years later, Haddad was really isolated and he died. He couldn't work, he couldn't have this. He died from these conditions. But he was, there is another, Mohammed Salah bin Murad, who is representing a little bit, not a little bit, pardon, the Zaytunian elite, published a book against Tahir Haddad, and we know the consequence of it. But at the same time, Mohammed Salah bin Murad against Tahir Haddad, and he is from the bourgeoisie, will promote his own daughter to create an organization for the women's rights. Donc, it shows a little bit how it is at the same time a question about power in the society. Donc, but Tahir Haddad, what is very important to know is that Tahir Haddad, like Abu al-Qasim al-Shabi, I suppose that you know about him. It's a very important poet in Tunisia. And the two of them started from the center of Tunisian most traditional institution of theologian and scholastic, and the Zaytuna University, and the two of them produced work of a legal and poetic nature that opened their society to a new humanism. Their works spurred the emergence of a new consciousness. Second element of this CSP is the emergence of the woman in public space and formal politics. And we have the proof, and I brought it for you today. We have the proof that several women, I collected 300 life stories about women who were struggling for their rights and against the colonialism in Tunisia. You can look at if you are interested. Donc, women were really present and they struggled for their rights. And something that it is very important, Bourguiba, who was against the fact that women take off the veil, will work with these all women, several groups of these women from different groups, will be working with them, and he will be having correspondence and planning actions. Donc it shows that he had an open mind, etc. And before the independence, the total independence, and before the vote of the constitution, which will be promoted in 1959, he will promulgate the personal status code in 1956, which it gives several rights to women. And we know that Bourguiba was probably influenced by Ataturk. He was influenced, but he thought that we could do better without all the violence that he saw in Turkey. And he wasn't so happy with what was happening in Egypt too. He thought that the women movements were too much for him, it was too much a movement of bourgeoisie. Donc, donc the CSP was promoted in 1956 and will give several rights to women, and the abolition of the polygyny, and the divorce will be allowed only through judicial procedures and not through repudiation, and equal pay for men and women, the right to vote and to be elected in office, and as encouraging women to take off the veil, the more close to the niqab, and in 1990s, with the Second Republic, and under the pressure of the feminist movement, what will bring that it will allow outlawing the ijbar, which it was in the meaning of the feminist group, that it is the right of the father to oblige a daughter who has never been married to marry even against her will, and the criminalization of the honor crime, among others. And as we know, in several Arab countries, most of the students are women today. Okay, donc it's not an exception, but it's a result of the work that was promoted by the society. Now, the question of celibate women, what's happening? In the Maghreb, this period has been marked by cultural and socio-economic change that have contributed to the marginalization of labor union, the increased circulation of image via satellite television channel reaching even the smallest village, with significant effect on the life and economic behavior of household with consumer goods, etc. Life, it became in Morocco as in Egypt. I can give you data if you want. Very, very, very difficult. It's more expensive even than in some place in Europe. Donc here, and most of the experts are facing these figures, are discussing more and more about what's happening, and we, among other things, we are seeing that the feminization of the agriculture and region experiencing high male immigration, the movement of young rural women to factory work on the coast, and the clandestine immigration into Europe. Now, and more research are having the same results. Why the youth can't marry? Alors, the reasons that are done by this research is that for difficulties, economic difficulties essentially, and the youth seems to have only one desire, is to leave the region. In the same time, family are seeing some crisis too. The rates of divorce, it's higher, and we have a situation of single parent families. Most of them are women. I will give you data. For example, we have in all ages for men divorced, 50% of them remarry. Is it correct in English? Remarry, and only one woman among 6 divorced women could be. Donc, voilà. Donc, this is one thing. Now we have another situation. Since the 1990s, the Arab world has been confronting a deep change of the structure of its population, which is completely new. We never saw this in the Arab world. 32% of the population is between the age of 15 and 29 in 2005, representing 1 million people. Okay. Now, what is the opinion of the demographs about this situation, which is completely new? We have a disequilibrium. Now, some of them attribute the 2/3 of the reduced number of births in Tunisia resulting from what we think about a family. To them, it's not true. It's to the imbalance in marriage pattern that work to the detriment of women. and how already in the 1980, half of the divorce, donc I cited these cases. And for some scholars, this is the consequences of what? The value that we attribute to the young women. When Tunisian men come back from Europe to marry, will choose younger women than at their age, in comparison with their age. And the second thing is that men have a possibility to marry two women from other religion, which is not the case of the Muslim woman. Donc and Philippe Fargue said, I will, please let me do this for you, for Egypt, for the case of Egypt, that if the condition that obtained at the beginning of the 1990s, such as reduction of living standards and lower state support, to continue, it was probable that 21% and something, 21% of women and 9.8% of men would never marry. We might suggest today, at the very least, that this condition should persist if they are not more. Donc, research studies are not bringing a solution, but what are the reactions, how the state are resolving these problems? Certain states, Arab states, okay, certain states will raise the money, etc., to help the youth to marry. Iran raised the temporary marriage, and the Tunisian, because probably with the state is very poor and he can't, etc., raised only, published only plaquette to promote marriage. But what's happening, and this is very important and probably dangerous for the personal status code, is that more and more we have the press is echoing the social malaise related to the phenomenon, and sometimes calling for the Urfi marriage. Donc, which is a little bit strange for a country where women are very well known for having struggled for their rights, etc. Now, please, only to give you some data. In Morocco, we have, in 1997, about 6,000 women married with foreigner people through internet. And to 6,000 in 2007. And this is probably the situation of the freedom in the country. Women have access to internet, the youth have access to internet, which is absolutely not the case of Tunisia. Donc women can't be. Alors, what's happening in Egypt? And if you are a little bit interested, you can go on the internet and you will find that some women celibate, they are not married, having blogs. One of them is, the title of it, عايزة أتجوز. And it was so successful, it has so big success among the youth that even the Shuruq, the editor Shuruq, decided to publish this chronicle and asking her to stop her blog and to publish it. There is another one, عرس باللبن لشخصين, for two people, rice with milk for two. Donc, it shows clearly, and they are speaking about it publicly, about these problems. Now, recently, between January and March, the Prime Minister, Nazif, lost his wife last year, decided to marry with a woman from the government. And because she was from the government, they couldn't keep it secretly. Donc, he announced it publicly. When he announced it publicly, it created a big debate among the youth in Egypt, and they created a strike through Facebook. It shows the power of the new technology, etc., etc. Okay, now through the new technology in Tunisia, we don't have access to this kind of technology with this capacity, etc. What's happened is that Al Jazeera will defend the rights of women wearing the hijab. And we know that in Tunisia it's very difficult, etc., and that we have a law against the veil since 1981. the justice, the court will decide that the hijab, this decree, it's not constitutional, and and even if the state is calling for support and women organization close to the state, or even the feminist women, they will give the caution to it, but state it's more and more, the power it's more and more in difficulties, because this new generation, it's among really the middle class, and the only support of the power is the middle class, and if the middle class is contested by this group, it will be difficult. Alors, quickly, I have to finish. I can't present to you, but what we know is that through the tradition, the construction of the identity through the rites of passage and tradition, there is two things that they are very, very, very important. The one is about marriage and the signification of marriage, and how for women, as for men, it is absolutely necessary to be married. It's an obligation even for them as their rights, and in Egypt they speak it about as a right to marry, for women to have children. To have a children, it's not enough. It has to be a son. Why it is a son? Why it is a son? And you know, I read a lot about infertility, etc., and how it is difficult. It's difficult for everywhere. It's a universal meaning for all women not to have a children. But in the cases of the Muslim world, and through this in the Maghreb, if you don't have a son who can be circumcised, what does it mean? Is to be separated from the mother. She can't be a member of the community. Donc it is really very, very important to have a son at the psychological level. I am not speaking about other things. Donc we have the meaning of the hair, that it is the organ sexual, and we have this notion that if you are not married, you can't be a member of the community. Then this group of women who are between these two rights, what's happened to them? The only way, and through I can't show it to you, the only way is to have wearing the hijab. And what are the new kind of religious practice in these cases is that one, hijab, which is related with the hair, etc. only, then with the prayer, this new ideology, how to keep yourself, etc. And the third is about the fast. And through the interview I had with the women, these new women celibate, specifically this new group, it's the way to control their pulsion, their sexual desire, and how not to go, etc. Now, I finish. I promise I finish. I have only one point, please, to finish on this. Okay. I would like only to read this for you. Donc, they don't have a choice. Through the traditional, the construction of the identity through tradition does not work anymore. They can't. Donc, how to construct a new identity? It will be, in these cases, through religion, because it's blocked in the other way. Then, what do we learn? Their practice. And they fast several days a week and several days a month, etc., etc. In a context where religious discourse is controlled by the political power, reflect a privatization of Islam, and their strategy of over-conformity contributed, as has Cripps argued with regard to the veil, to subvert convention. In Foucauldian terms, they make the body a vehicle of power and of dissent, and against all expectation, these new they defend the modernity contained in the personal status code and its corollary, their revolt against corruption, domination, and the importance awarded to material life over spiritual life. Reinvent a new emancipatory gender which rejoins the feminist principle that the personal is both private and political. The new practice again for them. They say, as Saba Mahmoud shows, a new autonomy in a situation where traditionally celibate women had no no social status without passing through marriage, childbirth, the birth of a boy, and his circumcision. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to open the floor now. Let me put the first question to all three panelists, starting with Amani. What is the new frontier for, reform women's rights, really? How do you see it? How Nayere sees it? And how, where do we go from here? Because we have countries, you gave us the example of Morocco, which has a very progressive personal status law. Nayere gave us the example of Iran, which is taking one step forward, 3 steps backward, not even 2. And Lilia, who tried to put what has been happening in the Maghreb and especially in Tunisia in a context of these personal status laws. So I would like all three of you to tell us a bit what the new frontiers are. Yalla, Amani.
Thank you.
Let's go with you.
Inshallah. Okay. I think the big issue, this is a question, of course, that has puzzled many of us, and trying to think about the best mechanisms of reform within the context of Muslim societies. And I think, so I guess the point that I've been trying to advocate is that we need to think of nuanced and innovative ways of engaging religious society, dealing with it on its own terms. So, for example, we have to stop only talking to people who share our viewpoints and resemble us, because in many cases, those people are also, if you may, a little bit above society in their own context. The elite of Arab societies are very good at engaging one another, but they unfortunately don't engage the grassroots. And so we need to figure out what's happening at the grassroots. I've never seen a donor-assisted project that says we're going to look at, let's say, women's halakas, or empower women within the mosques, or create associations that target empowering women within their own communities. We're always looking for the glitzy NGOs, women's rights empowerment, the ABCs of women's rights, and basically looking for people who share our ideas. That's great, and I'm not saying to abandon that strategy, but let's also look at the level of society and community and figure out why these outlets are empowering to the women themselves. When we look at public opinion data across the region, a lot of women support their involvement in religious society. They find as Saba Mahmoud's study indicated in Egypt and elsewhere, they are empowered by these networks, by these associations and whatnot. So I guess what I'm really calling for is reforming the way we do gender promotion and gender equality, and thinking about it and engaging people on their own terms. Again, because there is variation in the personal status regime, there's room for improvement, and we have to figure out the best mechanisms in terms of working with people on the ground. Now, having said that, the bigger question is, well, is the U.S. the best player to do that? That's entirely different issue, right? Because, as I said earlier on, the issue of gender is not just like, a cause and effect. If we alter this, we're going to have this outcome. There are layers and layers of problems in between. Economic development is certainly one of them. This is a region that needs to create 100 million jobs in the next 20 years to absorb the youth bulge. And of course, women are not going to get those jobs if men don't have those jobs. Not this, that's just the way it's going to work. So the question is, how do we promote economic development? Can we promote economic development without political reform? Well, why aren't we politically reforming the region? Then we have to talk about geostrategic considerations. The United States prefers stability over democracy. Then we have to deal with the fact, I have a study where I've consistently shown that the number of U.S. troops in any given country is directly correlated with a regression in women's rights. So you might ask, well, why? You know, the U.S. is there to promote women's rights. Because when the U.S. is on ground in Arab societies, it creates a lot of resentment, national resentment. And so regimes wanting to negotiate between allowing the U.S. to stay in their countries gives in to Islamist demands. So Islamists basically stayed out of the foreign policy considerations, but will give you what you want on gender. Hence, women lose their rights. So it's a very complicated situation, and you need to study it in its entirety. But nevertheless, at least at the grassroots level, if we're going to look at small reforms and small empowering mechanisms, we need to think about ways in which we can discourse and dialogue with people on their own terms, in terms of their religious environments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nayeri?
Yes, very difficult question, but we have several opportunities, new frontiers that have opened to us, but also several challenges. I think in part thanks to globalization. People tend to look at globalization rather negatively, many people, but I have found a lot of good things for women especially, and the new technology especially, as Lilia mentioned. So we have that. We have this the access, growing access of women and as well as men to the internet, which is an important tool to network, to learn, to build transnational collaboration among women activists. The other it is important because, before I go to other factors, is the prominence of the discourse of human rights, prominence of the discourse of feminism and women's rights. And I would also say the role of the United Nations has been very positive and has helped the third world women and women in Muslim majority countries to the devices like CEDAW, the Convention against, for elimination of discriminations against women. The CEDAW Convention has been an important tool that has given legitimacy, the language, to many women in even despotic regimes and conservative regimes to work around women's issues. Other changes, again, some of you mentioned, is demographic changes that is helping. The youth bulge, the youth that is looking for change, is demanding change. And the growing middle-class women, highly educated. The literacy rate has been unprecedented in the history of the Middle East and the Muslim majority countries. Women actually in many Muslim majority countries are doing better than men in university enrollments. Mm-hmm. It's true in Iran and in many other countries. So we have this highly educated, growing professional class of women. Although employment and economic empowerment is still a challenge, my friend here, Roxana, has been working on that how still in countries like Iran, even though we have highly educated women with growing number, but they don't have much opportunities for jobs, especially for formal employment. And the fertility rates is decreasing everywhere, which is helping women. Women's health is improving. And we have now the marriage crisis, as Lilia said, not only in Tunisia and Egypt, in many countries. In Iran also, marriage is a rising number of single women. These all are the material changes in the society, profound changes that are helping, has created a fertile ground for a strong women's movement. Without civil society push, without a women's movement, we cannot bring about any reform and change. But it is also important, fortunately, another frontier is that many feminists have now realized that just by copying Western feminism, and applying, the first wave, second wave, all those things is not working. They need to find an indigenous language. They need to be relevant to the context. You see, the goals are universal.
Right.
I don't agree with those who say that, women in Islamic countries, or to interpret Islamic feminism as if it is essentially different from other feminism. No, it's the same.
Right.
The goals are universal. They all want, no matter from what culture, what religion, religious background, they all want equal rights, human dignity, and removal of discrimination, right? Those are the main goals. But how to achieve those goals, what tactics to use, what language, what strategy are very context-oriented and very sensitive and requires insightful knowledge and contact with the grassroots, with people, with culture, with political sensitivity, with religious sensibility, and all that. So fortunately, we have now more understanding about the necessity of coalition building between secular feminists and Muslim feminists, Islamic feminists. That is also an important frontier. But an important challenge is that there is still growing fundamentalist movement, growing religious extremism, growing misogyny in many Islamic countries, and even in some countries there are regressive moves, as in Iran, and I'm a bit worried about even about Turkey, that we will now hear later from Binaz, to see whether our worries are founded or not. So that brings the question that Amni mentioned, the politics of the region. I mean, for example, the issue of the conflict between Palestinian and Israeli conflict is feeding fundamentalists. It has to be addressed. I mean, we have to have a holistic approach to foreign policy of the Middle East. We cannot just, the West cannot just raise the women's issues. It can actually be counter-effective if we do only that. We have to resolve the tension in the Middle East, the poverty question, the lack of this democracy deficit, all that, and what feeds the extremism and what feeds the fundamentalists is also important challenge.
Thank you. Lilia.
Thank you very much. Okay, I would like to say and to stick to one thing, that the past as today, we have always a negotiation. It's not something that negotiation, it's how you struggle, how you deal with it, what are the mechanisms, what are the tools that we can use, etc. Donc it's really very important. I can give you one example. For example, today the discourse of the power is to satisfy the different groups. He is speaking about equity.
Egalitarian.
No.
Equality.
Equity. No, it's different. Equity to satisfy the Islamists. And speaking about partenariat, and even in the law texts, it's not only discourse, it's how it is translated in the text of law. And he will be speaking about partenariat to satisfy feminist women. Today, we can find these two nuances. Partnership in the couple. And now, it shows how the negotiation, it's very strong, and how today he will be giving this to satisfy this group, and tomorrow he will be giving this to satisfy another group. Now, there is another question that it is really very important in the region, and we have to pay attention to this. At some point, are the state not using the Islamist as an alibi? I think we have to address this question too, because it's really very important, and it's like an hibou that you are. Donc it's important not to because in several countries the question of women rights, it's do you want to have the Islamist?
Yeah.
Okay, we don't want to have the Islamist. And then it created a coalition between the feminists and the women close to the state to agree to the language of the state, which it's
Anti-democratic.
it became anti-democratic with the other groups. And, you know, with the internet today, you can see how the reaction of the other groups to this, and it's not easy. Third things that I would like to mention too is that today, please, this is really presque prière, a prayer. Please, modernity is transnational. I take from you what you can take from me. And we have several things that are positive. Not everything is bad. Donc please, it's not good for the youth, as you mentioned, Hali, etc., and how the population, and you mentioned too, etc., how the population will react. Donc, we are for construct something that it will give us a chance to live all together, and not base it on hate, and not base it on Islamophobia, and not base it on regression of right of several people in different Arab countries too. Donc this is really very important. And then I will finish with this. Globalization and technology are working together. It's very good for some things, and they can be very bad for other things. Donc we have to take it into account how women could contribute to the debate about their rights, and to use the new technology and to protect themselves with a new technology. Thank you.
Thank you. Amani wanted to add something.
Just really briefly, based on the points that Nayara and Lydia raised about the holistic approach, and the way existing regimes benefit from Islamists who are mobilizing against women, and not all Islamists are mobilizing against women. Sometimes this serves the regime. So, for example, if you look at Jordan, year in and year out, you have honor killings legislation that goes into parliament to try to stop honor killings, and that's halted by Islamists, but the regime uses that to uniquely say to Western audiences, look at, if we allowed for more democracy, the Islamists will block women's rights, and that's why you should support us in our authoritarian ways, in our non-democratic ways, because we are much better than the alternative. But in fact, we also know that if the Jordanian regime indeed wanted to bypass the parliament altogether and just shut down the parliament, they've done that in the past, right? And so this situation where women are always being scapegoated to sustain the authoritarian status quo vis-a-vis also the geopolitics, the U.S., for example, being the closest ally to Jordan, needs to be taken into account in this larger holistic approach.
Okay, we are now opening the floor. Roxana, just please wait for the mic and also identify yourself. Our speakers for the next panel, if you want to make intervention and so on, please do. I mean, you know. Yes.
Oksana Bahramitash, Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you so much for a great panel, and welcome to the center. I wanted to ask Nayarif to tell us a little bit about the narrative of seculars and how it resonates with the religious fundamentalism, because I think that's very important to know how, in a body of a secular language, patriarchal, and they can come together. That's one question. The other one is that there is a problem of, you have all indicated that there's an increase in support among women who supported of religious groups and fundamentalist groups. And I am wondering that the issue of class, to what extent class, when you mentioned identity, Lydia mentioned identity, but I'm wondering to what extent class and class marginality plays a role in rising support among women for Islamist groups. Thank you.
Nayere is going to address the question of discourse between secular and the religions those strata, but briefly.
Okay.
Okay, and then I think it's an interesting topic. Maybe all three can address that, because in each of these countries we have this encounter between and this discourse. So, Nairi, you start.
Basically, there in one long article years ago, I wrote about three trends or three narratives. One was that all went against women's rights in practice. One was the conservative nationalists who are secular, but they always taught or argued that women are basically based on natural biological determinism, are to be basically play the role of mothers and wives, so they get education to become basically better mothers and wives. Even though they are for modernization, even though they want to progress, but they have very limited roles for women. So we have several figures, Kasravi, for example, and in history of Iran that come with that narrative. And then we have the left. Some of the left, the communists, argued that we can't have really equal rights for women unless we have a socialist system. So wait until we have socialism and don't divide us on gender grounds, and let's just unite and let's wait and postpone the women's rights until we have resolved the economy. So that is like economic deterministic approach, which is secular narrative. The third that is Islamist, that you all know, that what kind of they use this divine ordained determinism that dictates what women's role should be. Now, for the secular narrative of both liberal nationalism and conservative nationalism, I read to you just one quotation, since we don't have much time, from Hassan Nazi. As I said, especially because I use his case because he was so prominent during the anti-Khomeini struggle, but he in 1949 argued that, as we know, women do not have any psychological capacity for holding political status. Women, more than men, is a slave of fanciful wishes. The feelings of ambition, jealousy, and pride are found more in women than in men. Now, if she is allowed to participate in elections, an incredible chaos will be created in a woman's world. She will want to attract men as well as wanting to prove her superiority. You will even get schoolgirls dreaming of becoming Majlis deputies, the parliament deputies. The natural duties of women, such as motherhood and other family tasks, will be either totally ignored or seen as insignificant. So this is very common argument and narrative you can see among many seculars even. So that's the challenge that I was talking about.
Thank you. Would you like to add something? No? Lilia? Very brief.
Briefly, no. There's a question about the class. It's very important because in the case of Tunisia, all work what was done since the 1956 was to promote a middle class, and everything what was done was with this orientation. Now this middle class, it's very important, very large, and we are seeing more and more women in the public space, but how they are received in this public space and what is, on what capacity they can work and change their things, and the little témoignage that we have
witness
from internet or through novels or through journal, etc. It's very, very hard. They say that it is very, very hard for them. And for example, in Tunisia, where we promoted the CSP in 1956, we have the Zaytuna, which is the most important university in the Maghreb. We don't have any courses about women and Islam, which is a little bit strange. Right. Donc it shows how we give something, but in the other way, we have women who will be teaching Islam, but nothing about women, and through the eyes of men, through the masculine discourse, etc., and reproducing the patriarchy. The second thing that I would like to say that about technology, the globalization of the technology is very important. We can gain something, but we have to admit that the religious discourse, which is diffused by these new channels, etc., it's really, and I have something I could show to you. I prepared something. It's so misogyne that it is unbelievable that we can continue to have these kind of things without reaction. Donc, in the Tunisian case, for example, they promoted, the state was obliged to promote radio and TV, Islamic, etc. But you can see that it is, the satellite channels are much, much, much more popular. And the women that I had interviewed with them, most of them are looking at these channels more than the Tunisian channels, which is considered that it is compromised because it was created by the state. Thank you.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, just on the class dimension really quickly. I mean, it's very hard to think about the Islamist phenomena as strictly class because you find a lot of support. I mean, if you look at just like patterns of dress and where the support is allocated, you'll see that, you know, university campuses right now are a big phenomenon is going back to the religious, which, you know, those are our middle class sectors. The upper middle class women are taking on more Islam in the lower classes too. So you don't want to homogenize. I think there's different reasons for different sectors, but I think it's really important to understand the context. I mean, women are within states that are ineffectual. Rule of law is very weak. They don't feel like states protect their rights, and versus then traditions that are very, very, very regressive. So Islam for them, within this context, is a step better than the state, a step better than tradition, where within these movements they have become empowered, where they speak to each other with a solid voice. And the Islamist movements, and this is also a pattern emerging, have also been very savvy about now incorporating women within the movements. The Muslim Brotherhood is doing this. Iran, this is happening in Iran, the AKP in Turkey, Hamas in Gaza. When it won the election, the vast majority of people who voted for Hamas were women. And that's because these movements are making women feel efficacious and empowered within these networks.
I'm Sahar Khamis, an assistant professor in the Department of Communication, University of Maryland, College Park. Thank you very much to all the speakers. I learned a great deal from you this morning. I have one general question and then one specific question for Lilia. The general question is, actually it's a question and a comment. I think the term Islamic feminism is paradoxical. I'll try to make it very short. Because, Islamism and feminism for a long time have been seen as uncomfortable bedfellows, and they have not been seen in the minds of many as fitting very well together. How can we possibly go about promoting an alternative discourse that creates some kind of successful emerge between these two, seemingly or allegedly uncomfortable bedfellows of Islamism and feminism through producing a new reform from within the indigenous Islamic world, as some of you already mentioned, rather than from without this Islamic context altogether? This is a very important, I think, paradox that we're all faced with, and I'd like to hear some of your thoughts around it. My specific question to Lilia is about the globalization and technology, which is something I'm working on personally and very interested in. You said they're working together, sometimes in very positive ways, and sometimes also in some negative ways. I think you touched upon this, but I'd like to see you elaborate a little bit more about some of the positive and some of the negative ways through which new media can serve or disserve this growing Islamic feminism. Thank you so much.
Let me remind the overflow that we will take your questions. So there is an overflow on the fourth floor. So please write your questions and send it to us if you have any. Okay, who is going to go with the... Islamism and no Islam. Could you answer that question?
I think that's right on target. I mean, I tried to refrain from the use of the word feminism, not because I think what Naira said about universal values, that these are universal goals, whether you call it feminism or womanism, I call it gender empowerment. I guess the issue is dealing with these universal goals based on the terms existing within each context. So, meaning we have to take Islamic context seriously.
Yeah, briefly, Islamic feminism is paradoxical, especially when among the clerics and also secular feminists, secularists especially, and in academic thinking. But in practice, it is happening. So, but we don't have to name it within the context of a struggle, as Amani says, for example, in Iran, many women activists don't use even the word feminist. They call themselves فعالین حقوق زنان, the activists of women's rights, or advocates of women's rights. But in writings, of course, I mean, they may not use the word in their public statements, in their demonstrations, but in their analysis and, like at the more elite level, of course they use the word feminist. They, if you talk to them, many of them would say, I am a feminist, but I don't have to go around and put that badge on because it's not helpful. So it's a matter of pragmatic use of these terms.
Lilia, very brief,
yes,
brief.
I think that if we go back to the history of women, even in Islam, feminism was there already. Donc I think it is good to use it in the way that it create, it became subversive. I think it's very important that we don't lose it. It's not because the women who are working, for example, I'm taking some cases, they will be refusing the word of feminism, the women who are working with the state. So we have to distinguish a little bit who is using the term feminism and how. The second thing, which is, I think, very important is, for example, in the case of the vote, if you look at the history of the vote in the world through the women movements, you can see that it is not some. For example, Switzerland and France, they had it so late in 1945, and Switzerland. France, yes, and Switzerland it's much later, which it means that there is a negotiation, and we have to look at at what's happening in the world. The vote, it's a right that for all women over the world, and why in some circumstances and in some countries we will be having later or before. And this, I think, it's important to look at, and not only to stigmatize that in the Arab world, that in the Muslim world, they don't have this or they don't have that.
Question, please.
Hi.
Just brief question. We are running out of time, and I will allow one question, and that should be very brief and no comments. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Layla Magari. I'm from the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. My question is for Naire. In the case of Iran, in the past year and currently, it seems that women have been very active in the Green Movement and maybe even the majority at the protests and demonstrations. Yet it seems that there's no mention of women's rights as part of the larger Green Movement. Why do you think this is? And do you think that this democracy movement would be more successful if they embraced women's rights as part of their platform? Thank you.
Very brief.
Well, I don't agree that in this green movement, the women's issues are not being raised. It's not true. Basically, it is actually women's presence and role is very salient. Women are there, but just the movement, the overall civil rights movement has expanded so widely that you don't see as much, like, you know, you can't single out the women's banner per se, but they are part of the movement. They are intervening in the process. They are very cognizant not to lose the demands of women. And look, someone like Zahra Rahnavard has suddenly become an outspoken feminist. She's the very person who several years ago wrote against feminism, saying that it's a Western phenomenon. It doesn't apply to Muslim world. But now even she uses the word feminism in small gatherings and not very publicly. But she has become a voice for women's rights, and she is one of the leaders of this green movement. So I don't think I would worry, even though I think we should all, women activists, remain alert. I'm always promoting the green movement myself. But I think the women have learned their lessons from the past, especially from the 1979 revolution, and are very vigilant about the feminist issues and are doing feminist intervention within the movement. So I'm not worried about it now.
Just to add a quick sentence to what Nayireh said, the campaign leading to the presidential elections, both Mousavi and Karoubi and even Rezai had advisors on women's issues, and if someone like Karoubi said, if I become president, I'm going to appoint a Secretary of State who is female in order to be able to, she can then negotiate with Hillary Clinton. So it was, I think, that important. And I believe one of the reasons that Ahmadinejad nominated 3 women to his cabinet was A, he was aware of the importance of the women's vote, and B, he had lost a lot of his constituency during the violation of human rights, or the post-election violation of human rights. Yes, please.
Okay, Mervat Hatem, Howard University. And then you want to take you to task.
Please.
You started off by emphasizing figures that show that personal status laws, as well as women's political representation, are manifestations of how the region lags behind other regions. Yet, and these are the traditional issues that people raise when they discuss women's rights in the Arab world, in the Middle East. And then the rest of the panel, as well as you, moved on from that original position to suggest that there are many changes that are occurring in that part of the world, so that the question of the young people, of unemployment, of Islamism, and sort of the fact that women have found new discourses to express their own agendas, came up as actually more important than the issues of political representation and or personal status laws. So what I'm really asking is that are these, even though they're sort of historical issues, have been bypassed by a very dramatically changing part of the world where things are no longer what they seem to be. Very youthful populations, sort of political movements, social movements that are introducing new discourses, and therefore, is this are these the best measures for how women are doing in the Muslim world? Thank you.
I mean, these are excellent questions, Mirvat. So I mean,
to summarize the answer.
I'm going to be very quick, but this is a very large question, and I need to. So this is, on some days I wake up and I do my research and I think, look, there's hope and there's changes and there's progress and there's reform and things are getting better. But the fact of them, so, and also all of that is correct. And here's where we've seen successful reform. And as a scholar, I try to understand the negotiations that happened in Parliament that led to these type of reforms within an Islamic framework. So you're hopeful. But I also want to say that a part of me, as I stand up and I lecture, and I tell my students what's going on, is that it's still a very depressed position. And let me explain. On a lot of these objective indicators, economic activity ratio, well, not objective, but a lot of these indicators, economic activity ratio, percentage of women in formal employment, life expectancy, the literacy gap between men, well, that's narrowing down. But like these other parliamentary representation, women in public life, these indicators also mean something. And that when we even control, the truth of the matter is, when we control for socioeconomic development, still there's a deficit in Muslim societies. We need to start, and so for a long time, you know, I was of the framework that, no, let's keep contextualizing, let's keep explaining it away. But at some point you reach a point where it's like, we need to start dealing with these empirical realities also on their own terms and figure out why we know our women in the region are just as competent, just as capable, just as smart, just as lively, just as dynamic, and they're hitting ceilings early on in their careers. What's going on here? And let's try to understand the sources of reform. Hence, we go back to trying to figure out the variation, where there's been successes, what we've learned, how we can maybe shape the agenda. But I also am very cognizant of saying, like, these are big problems, not small problems. I mean, we often think of women as a residual category. Women's status are tied into all these other macro big problems in the region: the Arab-Israeli conflict, war, occupation, lack of democracy, lack of economic development. And so I understand where you're coming from. And I don't want to act like I'm schizophrenic, going back and forth, but they're big issues.
Yes, thank you. My name is Mindy Reiser from the United Nations Association here in Washington. For Amalie and Lilia, the context is incredibly complex, and Amani, you talked about the focus that needs to be put on the grassroots and how women, working class women from working class families, lower middle class women, are seeing the religious context as a source of empowerment. There are many interesting paradoxes. So for both of you, Lilia too, are women trying to make inroads in terms of playing roles, as in this country, trying to have roles in terms of leadership in religious teaching? Women are not imams as such, but we've seen efforts here in this country of women trying to transform practices in mosques. So talk about the interesting paradoxes of within the Islamic tradition, women trying to take increased agency and increasing leadership roles in the religious context.
Okay. Lilia, you go first,
Okay.
and then
quickly, what is important that, for example, there is a big competition actually in the Muslim world. I don't know if you are a little bit aware about it, but there is a big competition in how we can promote the women's rights. Donc we have one kind of movement which it will promote women's rights through a secular discourse and developmental discourse, etc. And we have, and this is the case of Tunisia, for example, and a little bit something that it is mixed in Morocco. They promoted the Mudawana, and at the same time they promoted women in the religious hierarchy, but in the same time it's to control the Islamist movement, not to promote women. And we have, for example, in the case of Syria and the case of Dubai, these two countries are asking, and Dar al-Iftah in these two countries are asking to promote women mufti in Damas and in Aleppo for the case of Syria, donc asking for 2 women, and Dubai are asking for having 6 women mufti, which is through education process of diploma. Donc it shows that there is a competition, and the most important thing now is how women who are concerned about their rights through secularism or through Islam or through states, because they are important too, and we have to work with them to make a link with them. How we can promote women's rights. This is, in my view, the most important thing today, and how we can use all tools, all kind of technology, and not to leave only the religious discourse, which is misogyne, to have the room when the women who are competent and they have their opinion, they can contribute to the public morality, to work too.
Okay.
Just really quick, because I know what time is an issue. I mean, these indeed are women, and I don't want to speak on the vast majority of women, but the women I've interviewed several women across different states on like why these religious vehicles, why not. And they'll basically say, look, God commanded us to take care of our societies, to play these leadership roles. We don't want to be wasted in our homes. But they use the language of Islam to kind of legitimate their access to the public sphere. And so this raises the issue of why other vehicles are not legitimizing their participation in the public sphere, and why this is the appeal. But see, I'm also getting to this point where I honestly don't care what vehicle they're using to access the public sphere, as long as, the fact of the matter is they're trying to define the debate now and get in there. But this raises the point of how do various segments disregard or play down then these religious spheres when we think of gender empowerment.
As for women preachers, just to add to what my colleague said, in Iran there is a whole new generation of women preachers being trained, and it started before the revolution, when Islam became a way of protest, So women would go to mosques where there was, in the private room, there was a woman who had the credentials to talk to them and teach them on religious issues. So it's quite common, and you'll be surprised to know that one of my women guards in prison, the oldest one, was a woman who had religious studies, and she had reached the level of what we call Dars Kharij. I mean, if she would have finished that level, she would have been allowed even to, she would have reached a certain status where she could have had followers. So, it is becoming, but I'm a bit concerned about that, and because I believe that this will lead to more segregation, because at least, this day when you go to mosques, yes, women go to a different part of it, men go a different part. You go as a family, and nevertheless there is somehow an indirect mixing and mingling. But if you have your woman preacher, I mean, even that door would be closed to you. So, I have very mixed feelings about it. I think I'm going to stop the meeting now. Please join me in thanking our